Hello, my name is Owen. Today I will be giving you my top 10 fantasy books of all time that I've read. Fantasy is the primary genre that I read, so it's the genre I feel like I know the most about, and that I'm most qualified to give like at least a decent recommendation. This list is comprised of, I didn't want to take multiple books from the same series, so if it's from a series, it's only one book in the series, and I tried to keep the authors varied, although there is one notable exception, which we'll get to. But jumping straight into my list, you guys are going to hate me for my number 10. And you're going to, listen, it's not indicative of the rest of the list, but my number 10 fantasy book of all time is William Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, I know what you're thinking. Come on. That's a play, you moron, and it's not even fantasy. Well, I beg to differ. There are swords in it, and there's a ghost. Sounds pretty fantastical to me. Not that swords mean it's fantasy, but ghosts aren't real, in case you didn't know. But I love Hamlet. I'm a huge fan of Shakespeare in general, but Hamlet is the first Shakespeare's work that I read, and I've never seen it performed, so I don't even see it as a play, or I haven't experienced it as a play. But I usually try to read that like once every couple of years. I just find it very beautiful and tragic, but so human, and I think that's what makes Shakespeare great. But I don't need to tell you guys that because you've been hearing it, I'm sure, all your lives. But if you're going to read Shakespeare, if you're not into Shakespeare, I recommend starting with Hamlet. And I have seen some Shakespeare performances, and I'm sure Hamlet's the same way, where if you see it, and you're not a fan like the weird word, the old language, the prose, if you see it in person, it'll come to life. And I can't wait for the day where I see Hamlet performed live, but it's a great story. I'm sure you already know much about it. If you don't know the story, just watch The Lion King first. It's the same thing, except it's beautiful, and I love it. It's number 10. The rest of the list gets more traditional, trust me. Number 9, we have Joe Abercrombie's Before They Are Hanged. This is the second book in his first Law trilogy, and I think I liked his first 3 books in the trilogy like almost equally, but the reason I picked Before They Are Hanged is because when I was reading that series, I'd never read something in the category of grimdark, as it's called, like super gory, brutal, violent, evil fantasy. Joe Abercrombie's a master at doing that. So the first book, I was kind of just like dipping my toe in the water of this like subgenre of fantasy, and I ended up liking it. And the second book is like, I know the characters, I know the world, and I got so invested in this story. And Joe Abercrombie, I must say, writes the best action set pieces of any fantasy writer currently working today. They're just so visceral and like get your adrenaline pumping in ways that authors, very rare for them to do, at least for me. The reason I didn't put the third book in this series is because the series is so dark that I had to stop reading books after the third one. I am very soft. But listen, I said, this is the first grimdark series I ever read, and the ending of the third book, I was just like, man, what? It's not worth it, man. You know what I mean? Like, it was one like that. Like, I had to push Abercrombie to the side. I didn't start reading him until the last 6 months or so. Again, because I was like, I just can't. My heart can't take it. I had to watch like a Disney movie or something after that one as like a mental refresher. That's why I didn't put the third one, because it was just, not that it was bad. It was just emotionally jarring. But I like the second one, I guess, the best for that reason. That was my number 9, Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. Moving into my number 8. We have Mistborn-Brandon Sanderson. This is one of the most popular modern fantasy books of all time. And the reason it's on my list is not only because it's a great book, it's what got me into fantasy. I think I read it probably like 5 or 6 years ago. Before that, I only traditionally read, I guess I read fantasy and like young adult novels and stuff like that, like Fablehaven and Ranger's Apprentice and stuff like that. But I was looking to take my step into the adult fantasy and get out of the young adult. And Mistborn was what was recommended to me. And I read it, and I've become one of the biggest Sanderson fans ever since then. I read almost everything he puts out. Definitely everything that comes out in his Cosmere. He just had a book recently come out, The Lost Metal, which is in this era 2 of Mistborn, just came out. Can't wait to read it. Can't wait to get my hands on it. But Mistborn is just a masterclass at world building. The way he creates this entire planet and its unique magic system. everybody who's read this book raves about the magic system and how detailed it is, and I had never read anything like this in my life. It was so unique, but it's so visceral and cinematic. I say this all the time in the best way possible. Brandon Sanderson is the Marvel cinematic universe of fantasy novels, and not because it's all connected, because that's almost like one step too far for me. Like, I can't find the connections between all his books, but just in a way that it's like emotional and action-packed. It's just a blockbuster. All his books are blockbusters, and Mistborn is the first for me. And it's absolutely incredible. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. Now, moving on to number 7, in a little bit of a lighter, not borderline fantasy, but it's The Princess Bride. The Princess Bride movie is probably one of my favorite movies, if not my favorite movie of all time. So a couple years ago, I decided I wanted to read the book. And what I thought was really unique about the book was that I was expecting like a carbon copy of the movie, or the movie to have been a carbon copy of the book. But it's actually a lot. It's funny, and it's almost funnier for a different reason why the movie is funny. Like, the movie is funny because it's like campy, and it's just like medieval, and it's humorous and fun and light. But the book is so much more dry because it gives you more perspectives of like the author in the real world, like getting his book published. And then like he had the version I read, he had the added section about him making the movie about the book. So it's like very meta, but it's just very dry. And he really commits to the bit of this being a real book that he's just like adapting. And it's so funny. And I really like it. And there's not enough good comedic fantasy out there, other than like Terry Pratchett. And I guess I really haven't read much of Terry Pratchett, like the whole Discworld. I read Guards, I think, but there's just not enough good comedic fantasy out there. That reminds me, I gotta read more Terry Pratchett. But The Princess Bride is definitely one of those. If you like the movie, you'll like the book, but for different reasons, and that's why I recommend it and why it's on my list. Going in at number 6, my number 6 favorite fantasy novel is Wizard in Glass by Stephen King. This is the 5th book in the Dark Tower series. Now, this one's interesting because I know there's a lot of fans of the Dark Tower series, and my experience with it is tumultuous, to say the least. I read the first book, thought it was very boring, but most people say that that's a rough one. Second book, really liked. Third book, it was good. Fourth book, it was good. I really hope Wizard in Glass isn't the 4th book. I think it's the 5th book. But anyway, regardless, Wizard in Glass is the prequel. So you're going through the story of the Dark Tower. Wizard in Glass is in the middle of the series, and it's a prequel. But it's set in like an old Western town. It's Roland when he was younger. And it's a very self-contained story with only like the beginning and the end going to like our modern day with Roland and Eddie and Susanna and stuff like that. But this story, I don't know where it came from, because like I was just like middling enjoying this series, and I didn't even finish the last book, but we're not going to talk about that right now. But Wizard in Glass, I was bawling my eyes out for no reason. I did not know I was that emotionally invested, because it's also a prequel. Like, I know Roland's not going to die, because like half of the books I read already, like he's very much an old man or older man. He's not a kid, right? So obviously he lives, and I even knew what happened, because I'm pretty sure they talked about it a bunch of times before that. But Stephen King, man, like, people say he's overrated. Dude, this, like, you could read this as a standalone. If you're not interested in Dark Tower, read Wizard in Glass. Your tear ducts will not forgive you, but your heart will. And also, if it's like fantasy Western too, which is also a unique thing that you don't really read much of in fantasy. Moving on to number 5, we have from Song of Ice and Fire, A Storm of Swords. I read this book nary but a few months ago, but it has reached the number 5 spot on my list. That's because I was already a Game of Thrones fanatic from the show. So when I read this book, I instantly knew it's on the list of all-timers. It's just the most Game of Thrones-y Game of Thrones book that's out there. Keep in mind, I have not read A Dance with Dragons yet, because I have not yet got my copy on it. So that one very much could be better. But right now, Storm of Swords is the creme de la creme of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's just so action-packed. with events, and I think the character work is the strongest in the series. And like I said in my review on the channel, its pacing is by far the best. It's really where I think the series hits its stride. And if not for A Feast of Crows and Dance with Dragons, like the POVs being separated, that's the only thing that makes Feast for Crows a little bit weird. But you could tell, like, by this point in the series, by Storm of Swords, George R.R. Martin is in it. He's in the zone. And man, I just wish he would continue it. Don't we all, though? Moving on to number 4, we have another very popular modern fantasy book, but I feel like not everyone has read it yet, which means it could still be recommended forever. The Lies of Lamora. This book is a masterpiece. It's very similar to Mistborn in the sense that it has fantastic world building, except it's a lot more intimate and detailed, because instead of like introducing the entire world, the entire magic system, it's just Camor. It's this city, this Venice-like city, and it's this group of ragtag thieves and scammers. And I love a good heist story, and this is so immediately, like, the concept of the book caught my interest, and it's just Locke and John are like the best fantasy duo of all time, and their bromance is just absolutely so fascinating to read. And like I said, the world building is so immersive, and it's also kind of similar to Joe Abercrombie's series, where it's dark, but it's also like dark humor, and it's not as dark, it's not as grim dark as Joe Abercrombie, but it's a little bit there. It's a little bit. It's like one step removed, but it's almost like more world building, atmospheric, and I would say, than any other books on this list so far, because you really feel like the city of Camor is like one of the characters, and also the plot's just great. I really liked the next 2 books in the series as well. People think that the first one is like far and away the best. I would say that the second one is on par with it, and the third one like drops off, but just a little bit. So I'm hoping for the 4th book in that series as well. But yeah, Lies of Lamora by Scott Lynch. I don't think I said that the first time. That is number 4. Moving on to number 3, we have The Bonehunters by Steven Erikson. This is let's see if I can remember, the 6th book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I think it's number 6. I'm just really bad at numbers, guys. This was my favorite book of Malazan Book of the Fallen. It took me about a year to read that series, and that's the one that has stuck with me the most. When I did my rankings of all the Malazans, that was my number 1, and it has to make the list. Relying a little bit on the series as a whole to make it so high on the list, like with the context of me enjoying the entire series, it has to be high on the list. But The Bonehunters is what Storm of Swords is for Song of Ice and Fire. It's peak Malazan, and it's peak character work, and it's peak climax after climax. And this book is 2 great books shoved into one like succinct single book. Like, it's not like a crazy, like it's all his books are long in this series, but I don't want to spoil it because like this is not the video for that, but there's the part where it's like, wow, what a great ending. There's another great ending coming up. You know what I mean? It's like constantly raising the stakes, and the character work is there, and it's where I was most invested in the characters. And check out my Malazan videos to explain to you why that's so great. But it's a great series, and that's by far my favorite one. Can't wait to dive back into that world with Esselmont's books very soon. I got them lined up. They're in the queue. For those of you, if they're waiting, or if you care, it's in the queue. You will care eventually. Going to our number 2 spot, we're getting up there. The Lions of Alrassan by Gavriel K. This one's another tearjerker. And this one also like almost pays an homage, at least in my brain, the way that the synapses connect each other, with our number 10 spot, Hamlet, because Gavriel K is the most poetic writer, at least on this list, and probably that poetic fantasy writer that I've ever read. Besides Shakespeare, of course, I put him on the list. I get it. I understand. But Gavriel K is, I don't know how to say it other than he's an artist. His words flow like water, and they touch on emotions that you didn't know were there. And that's just a poor man's interpretation. But his story, there's action in it, but it's not about the action. It's about the prose. And that sounds really boring, but I can't explain it to you any other way than that. The way he writes about his characters, and he writes about his characters' thoughts and their emotions, you're immediately invested in them. And my favorite part about this book is there's a lot of conflict between the main characters, and yet I like all of them equally, and they show very few, if any, flaws. So for that reason, it takes like an almost elevated fairy tale legendary view. Like these characters are almost too perfect to have ever existed, and they're not realistic. They're like figures of myth, but we're in their heads, and it's a tragedy. It's a tearjerker, and by the end, I was also bawling my eyes out. Which is what I said. I said it happened twice on this list, but it does not happen often. So the fact that it happened again, and also like Guy Gavriel, I just got to read more of his books. Taigana I read was also a little bit of a tearjerker, but I think Lions of Alrassan is better than that book, and it's my number 2 fantasy book of all time. So think about that. Now, the book you've all been waiting for. What's going to beat Shakespeare? What's going to beat Stephen King? What's going to beat Mistborn-Brandon Sanderson? What's going to break all the tearjerkers? Well, our number 1 spot is the only man who could defeat all those authors and defeat the king of fantasy, Brandon Sanderson, is Brandon Sanderson. Yeah, all right, we're bringing him back for the list. It's number 1. It is the Stormlight Archive, book number 2, The Words of Radiance. I'm sorry to bait you like that. Brandon Sanderson is the king of fantasy, and you cannot deny that he is the most popular fantasy author at the moment, and probably will be the most popular fantasy author of all time, barring Tolkien himself. The Words of Radiance is, in my opinion, his best book by far that he has ever written, and the greatest fantasy novel that I have ever read. For the reasons I said about Mistborn. It's cinematic, it's emotional. I think his characters in the Stormlight Archive are the most engaging, and maybe that's because it's his longest series by far, but this is only the 2nd book, so maybe I don't have like all 4 books of like character development at this point, but when I read that book, there's the scene, and if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about, where Kaladin does something that's just so badass. I kid you not, I put the book down, I did one of these, and I had to take a lap. I had to take a lap because my adrenaline was spiking. And it was like the most, like after like I did that, I'm like, what the heck just happened to me? I was just looking at symbols on a page, and my blood pressure shot up to the moon, and I felt like I was like in a high school football game. I don't know, like I felt like I could run through a wall. And I had never experienced tearing up is one thing, like emotion, like sadness, that's one thing. But like, you're getting my blood moving. You make me feel like I just took like a 5-hour energy and injected it straight into my bloodstream. Right? And it's not all popcorn stuff either. Like this is like character, like emotional, like Dalinar, Kaladin, some of the greatest fantasy characters of all time. And then they do stuff that's the most badass things you've ever seen. And it's all in your head. It's amazing what that man can do with that book. Right? I recommend Stormlight Archive just for book 2 alone. I mean, you got to read book 1 first just for the context because it's absolutely all over the place. But I cannot stress enough the emotional impact. What I would do to read Words of Radiance again for the first time. It's crazy. Highly recommend it. That's my top 10 list. Just to recap for you. Number 10, Hamlet. That's not fantasy. Shut up. It is. Number 9, Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. Number 8, Mistborn-Brandon Sanderson. 7, The Princess Bride by William Goldman. Number 6, Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. Number 5, Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Number 4, Lies of Lamora. Number 3, The Bonehunters. Number 2, The Lions of Alrassan. And number 1, Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. Thank you so much, guys. Check out these books. I'll have them all listed in the description because I don't like editing. Bye.